In almost every culture on Earth, there are legends regarding mysterious benefactors who came from a distant land and taught the native peoples skills which were instrumental to the development of their civilizations. As a mythological archetype, we refer to these figures as culture or civilizing heroes. Wherever they are said to have appeared, they brought with them profound knowledge of the arts and sciences that were not known to the local people with whom they came into contact. According to the people who received them, the great heights their civilizations would reach came about directly due to the guidance of these culture heroes. Proponents of the Atlantis theory point to these myths as being based on true history, the recollection of actual Atlantean migrations, of a people who had attained a level of sophistication significantly greater than most of the world at the time. If Atlantis had reached its peak well before 10,000 BC, this certainly would have been the case. Even today, we see a disparity between the more and less developed nations of the world, so it's not completely far-fetched to imagine this scenario. Just as Poseidon helped to establish Atlantis, perhaps the Atlanteans, reaching outward from their homeland, established colonies both to the east and to the west. As it is referenced in the stories that they were great mercantilists, it would have been in their interest to set up outposts and to help other people commodify their resources to expand their own markets, in the same manner as the British Empire. And later, when their home was destroyed, they would have naturally sought to civilize their places of refuge. Furthermore, it seems plausible that certain wise men would have acted as missionaries, moving from place to place among people of lesser means in an effort to spread their doctrines and enlighten the world, just as missionaries try to do today. Working from this hypothesis, a complex picture emerges, involving multiple groups and individuals from the greater Atlantic continent, which traveled to different places at different times and for different reasons, both before and after the cataclysm. The cultural similarities we find in isolated parts of the world are attributed to these migrations, which all go back to a common root source. We will now explore just a few of these mystifying culture hero myths. Welcome to the Hidden Passage. Among the many Mesoamerican groups, known collectively as the Nahuas, there were many culture heroes. But perhaps the most influential of all is Quetzalcoatl. While recognized among several Nahua tribes going back to the earliest inhabitants of the region, he was especially revered among the Toltecs, who considered him to be the founder of their civilization. The name Quetzalcoatl means feathered serpent, and many of his depictions are that of a giant snake with a plume of brilliant feathers. In later representations, he is portrayed as a man. The reasons for this variation are unclear, but it may have to do with the belief that gods could incarnate as humans, also that gods would reincarnate many times in new forms. Quetzalcoatl's popularity caused future priests and rulers to adopt his name, further complicating an attempt to pinpoint any historicity. Another factor that may explain the transformation is the belief that certain people were descended from the gods, as was the case with the Atlantean kings. The Nahua culture hero Wotan declared himself to have divine lineage as the son of the serpent. Quetzalcoatl, in some accounts, was also believed to have had a divine virgin birth as the son of the creator god. Interestingly, he appears to embody personas of both man and serpent simultaneously. Early missionaries gave reports of local sorcerers with the ability to transform into animals, and in the Popol Vuh, it is written that, quote, "Truly Quetzalcoatl became a wonderful king. Every 7 days he ascended to the sky. Every 7 days he followed the path to the abode of the dead. Every 7 days he put on the nature of a serpent, and he became truly a serpent." Also, we must consider the fact that many culture heroes who were real people often became deified as a result of their heroic deeds. Whatever the case may be, we end up with tales of a mythical quality regarding the serpent and pseudo-historical accounts of the semi-divine man, which at any rate are connected. To understand this mystery, it is first helpful to explore the symbolism of the feathered serpent itself, which is expressed in the union of a creature of the heavens with a creature of the earth. The story of Quetzalcoatl's creation tells that the god Tlaloc, while producing rain, sees a group of snakes emerge from a cave to drink. One of the snakes, being afraid of the light, stays behind. Seeing this, Tlaloc becomes intrigued and coaxes the snake to come out of hiding. When he finally does, he is taken by the resplendent beauty of the daylight, and gazing up at the birds soaring above him, wishes to join them. Tlaloc decides to grant his wish.
"I believe in you."
And sends a wind to carry him up into the sky.
"Go."
The snake flies into the sun and re-emerges as the great plumed serpent. From then on, he vows to bring the divine light down to those living in darkness. He is given the title of Fifth Son, as it was believed that he descended to the underworld and gathered up the bones of those who had perished in the cataclysms of previous ages, and, mixing them with his own blood, allowed the new race of humans of the current age to be born. It was for this reason that human sacrifice to him was prohibited, as to do so would be to kill a part of Quetzalcoatl himself. The qualities of this god, as we will see, have much overlap with the culture hero. We should also recognize Tlaloc as a recurring character in our stories of interest, being the same god to issue the flood in the story of Coxcox, and to whom the Mexican pyramid of Cholula, built by the surviving giants, was dedicated. As the man, Quetzalcoatl was said to have been a foreigner who had come from the east, from beyond the sea. In one account, he is said to have arrived with a group of people dressed in robes. His physical appearance was distinctly different from the native people. In many portrayals, he is depicted as having a long beard, a characteristic shared among many culture heroes of the American continent. 16th century historian Geronimo Mendieta described him as fair-skinned, with an exceptionally strong stature, broad forehead, and large eyes. Another source describes him as homely, with an abnormally long head. Others among the early settlers of the region from Aztlan were also claimed to have had some of these traits, Of his dress, Mendieta says that he wore a mitre on his head, a long white robe decorated with red crosses, and carried a sickle. Quote, "His habits were ascetic. He never married and was most chaste and pure in life, and is said to have endured penance on a neighboring mountain, not for its effect upon himself, but as a warning to others. He condemned sacrifices, except of fruits and flowers, and was known as a god of peace. For, when addressed on the subject of war, he is reported to have stopped his ears with his fingers." Beyond his piety, Quetzalcoatl was also known as a religious reformer, credited with the construction of 4 temples and teaching doctrines of peace and fellowship, which were said to be a radical change from the previous institutions of warmongering groups. He was also said to have been a powerful magician and performed many miracles. Through his works, he became the patron of priests. He created a mystery school tradition, which carried the image of the feathered serpent as its emblem, through which his wisdom was communicated to and entrusted with the local wise men. He was also skilled in many arts and sciences, and was said to have introduced astronomy, writing, the calendar system, metallurgy, masonry, and the mining of obsidian. His followers wanted for nothing and were rich with resources. He also introduced corn seed to them and taught its cultivation, which was not the least of his achievements, as maize production was vital to the advancement of civilization. Interestingly, the domestication of corn is known to have occurred 10,000 years ago, which was not long after the supposed destruction of Atlantis. After having reigned for many years as the illustrious priest king, eventually his tenure came to an unceremonious end. The legends state that this came about when the growing resentment among the warrior class and the old cults of bloodthirsty gods reached a boiling point. Evidently, they had taken exception to his cessation of human sacrifice and sought to re-establish their old ways. Tezcatlipoca, the representative god of these opposing factions, finally drives out Quetzalcoatl through the use of black magic, causing him to doubt his own virtue. In other accounts, he is poisoned, which slowly kills him. Manly Hall writes that this act symbolized the corruption of his teachings by the unenlightened. At any rate, finding the situation to be hopeless, the despondent Quetzalcoatl departs. In what may be a final act of atonement, he throws himself onto a pyre and self-immolates, whereby his soul descends to the underworld for 4 days before ascending to the heavens, immortalized as the planet Venus, the morning star, in the archetypal manner of the dying rising god. Here we see an apotheosis similar to the snake flying into the sun. In another version, he leaves the same way he had come many years before. Quote, "The old and weary man called to the sea, and out of the waters came a raft of serpents. He stepped upon this strange craft and was carried away into the land of the sun's beginning."
Goodbye.
Manly Hall, America's Assignment with Destiny. Before leaving, he announced that he would return at the head of white-faced men. It was this prophecy that caused the Aztec ruler Montezuma to initially regard Hernan Cortez and the conquistadors as divine emissaries, which of course ended up being a tragic miscalculation. Given all of this information, if we are to entertain the possibility that Quetzalcoatl was a real historical figure, it is apparent that we are dealing with someone who was very different than the natives with whom he came into contact. He brought with him unique ideas and customs from his own culture. If this story was based in truth, where on earth did he come from? No other cultures are known to have ever traveled to the Americas in the pre-Columbian era, aside from perhaps the Vikings, but Quetzalcoatl does not appear to match Viking culture. So, could we be dealing with a visitor from the lost civilization of Atlantis? His association with the creation of man and the fifth sun would support this theory, assuming that Atlantis was destroyed at the end of the fourth epoch, or the biblical flood. Where else can we find possible records of these Atlantean missionaries? The Egyptian god Osiris, after his establishment of the Egyptian civilization, was said to have traveled the world in order to help other peoples by teaching them agriculture. The god Saturn, who was said to rule the western Cronian Sea and its Saturnian continent, came to Italy and taught the people agriculture and many other things that were unknown to them. This connection of Saturn to Atlantis may explain the myth of Saturn eating his own children. Another character often pointed to is the Chaldean Babylonian Oannes, emissary of the god Ea. This was a being who also emerged from the ocean riding a serpent, a detail that has obvious parallels to Quetzalcoatl. He is depicted as a fish man, in that he had a human body but appeared to wear the body of a fish as a sort of costume or dress. This may have been a primitive people's attempt to describe a suit of armor of some kind, or chainmail resembling the scales of a fish. According to this legend, this mysterious being came to share wisdom with the people. He taught them many skills, such as hunting, cooking, weaving, agriculture, and mining. Furthermore, he introduced writing, music, medicine, architecture, all the basic arts and sciences. Like Quetzalcoatl, there seems to be at least 5 different people concealed within the identity of Oannes over a long period. That was either interpreted as one being with exceptionally long lifespan or several re-embodiments, which may indicate that these were actually groups of people, or several individuals belonging to the same culture who succeeded one another. The North American Indians retain legends of holy men dressed in bird feathers who came up out of the sea to instruct them in the arts and crafts. There are many more examples all over the world of these culture heroes who came from the sea or some distant land imparting gifts of knowledge. In every case, they promised to return, but never did. Is this because they perished in the cataclysm which destroyed their homeland? Are the remnants of their legacy to be found in the great monoliths and institutions of the ancient world? Another reference to Atlanteans may be found in the myths regarding the races of supernatural beings said to have settled in Ireland. The Book of Invasions attempts to link these multiple migrations together into one cohesive narrative. While its information has been deemed dubious as an attempt to Christianize pagan mythology, we may yet find some truth in it. The story begins with the people of Cessair, named after a daughter of Noah. It is said that they had been warned of the flood beforehand, but were denied a place on the ark, and so they traveled to Ireland seeking refuge. There are 4 subsequent groups that settle in Ireland, all of which are said to be descendants of Noah. This is our first Atlantean connection. if we are to entertain the possibility that the flood myth is actually the story of the destruction of Atlantis. One of these groups, the Fomorians, a race of tyrannical giants, were said to have come from the west. The later arrival of the Tuatha de Danaan culminates in a large battle between another group, the Fir Bolgs, over control of Ireland. All of these groups were said to be very sophisticated and controlled large fleets of ships. The Tuatha de Danaan were especially advanced, possessing great supernatural power and knowledge that they shared with the local people. They were seen as gods, but also appeared to be a race of actual people. They too had arrived on ships, and they also appeared to have technology. During the great battle against the Fir Bolgs, the king Tuatha lost his hand, and we are told that an artificer replaced it with one made of silver, the fingers of which were actually capable of motion. Lastly, we should consider the mythical Tir na Nog as being a possible reference to Atlantis. This was a kingdom that existed in the otherworld, where the Tuatha de Danaan dwelled, the passage to which is often conceived as being reached by going underwater or by crossing the Western Sea. It is described as Elysian, sometimes referred to as the Promised Land. It is even described as having fortresses made of precious metals, which is certainly reminiscent of the descriptions in the Atlantis story. The following is an old Irish poem. Mother, I've been on the cliffs out yonder, straining my eyes o'er the breakers free, to the lovely spot where the sun was setting and sinking into the sea. The sky was full of the fairest colors, pink and purple and palely green, with great soft masses of gray and amber, and great bright rifts of gold between. And all the birds that way were flying, heron and curlew overhead, with a mighty eagle westward floating, every plume in their pinions red. And then I saw it, the fairy city, far away o'er the waters deep, towers and castles and chapels glowing, like blessed dreams we see in sleep. What is its name? Be still, Acushla. Thy hair is wet with mists, my boy. Thou hast looked perchance on the Tir na Nog, land of eternal youth and joy. Out of the sea, when the sun is setting, it rises golden, fair to view. No trace of ruin or change of sorrow, no sign of age where all is new. Forever sunny, forever blooming, nor cloud nor frost can touch that spot, where the happy people are ever roaming, the bitter pangs of past forgot. High on the cliffs the lighthouse keeper caught the sound of a piercing scream. Low in her hut the lonely widow moaned in the maze of a troubled dream, and saw in her sleep a seaman ghostly, with seaweed clinging in his hair. Into her room all wet and dripping, a drowned boy on his bosom bare. Over Death's Sea on a bridge of silver, the child to his father's arms had passed. Heaven was nearer than Tir na Nog, and the golden city was reached at last. Aside from these culture heroes that seem to mysteriously come and go, perhaps we can expand our field of interest to more central gods, some of whom have already been mentioned. These are not the primordial gods of creation, as Ignatius Donnelly makes clear, but secondary orders who are not involved in creation at all, but are rather acting as overseers, taking up management of the world. These include many deities in polytheistic religions, such as the Titans of the Greeks, the Tuatha de Danaan of Ireland, and Vanir and Aesir of the Norse. Of particular interest to researchers of Atlantis, as well as the ancient alien theorists, is the mythical age in the remote past, described universally as the time when the gods walked the earth. In Egypt, prior to the first pharaoh Menes, it is stated that the kingdom was ruled by the gods themselves. In the Sumerian kings list, the demigod Alulim, descended from heaven, is recorded as having been the first king. It is interesting to note that historians consider the kings list as historically accurate until the era of the god kings, where it is then considered myth, since these rulers were said to have reigned for hundreds or even thousands of years. There is some debate as to the calculation of time, as Egyptians initially used a lunar calendar before switching to solar, but if we are to assume solar years are used in the chronicling of Egypt, the reign of the gods, which then passed to demigods, and then to the spirits of the dead, totaled roughly 25,000 years. The Sumerian kings list spans a staggering 241,200 years before the flood, and then another 24,510 years after it. As the first rulers, these divine beings are naturally credited with the establishment of civilization. They were known to be wise and communicated their wisdom to the people. Quote, "They had a strict sense of justice and punished crime rigorously and rewarded noble actions." Alexander Murray's Manual of Mythology. So if these early rulers were based on actual people, it's clear that they had experience in running a society, suggesting that they came from an earlier one. While they were of course thought to be supernatural, in many respects they resembled us. They were fallible. They lived and died, and some, such as Osiris and Odin, were even said to have been buried in actual marked grave sites, Osiris having his tomb somewhere along the Nile and Odin in Uppsala. Quote, "There were tales of personal visits and adventures of the gods among men, taking part in battles and appearing in dreams. They were conceived to possess the form of human beings, and to be, like men, subject to love and pain, but always characterized by the highest qualities and grandest forms that could be imagined." Ibid. These gods were more than simply personifications of natural forces. They were dynamic beings known to have many different attributes, and perhaps because of a particular great deed in life or exceptional skill, became patrons of certain attributes. Could some of these gods have been based on real people? Greek historian Plutarch seemed to think so, declaring the gods of Egypt to have been antediluvian kings. Were they also Atlantean kings who established colonies after their homeland was destroyed? Since this is supposed to be a podcast on the supernatural, I will hold out the possibility that these beings were more than normal humans as we know today. Perhaps we should acknowledge the possibility of some non-human advanced influence as playing a role in the Atlantean mystery. Consider this quote concerning the Greek gods. Quote, "Their physical strength was extraordinary, the earth shaking sometimes under their tread. Whatever they did was done speedily. They moved through space almost without a loss of a moment of time." Murray's Mythology. I'll be covering Theosophy's theories on human evolution in a future episode, but for now I will just say that they believed early humans also had more psychic abilities than humans of today, which may account for some of these godlike abilities. These powers of the gods is what a lot of ancient alien theorists point to in asserting that the gods were extraterrestrial, with advanced technology. But can we not also consider the possibility that the technology was created here, that at one point humans had advanced beyond what we give them credit for? This thesis is effectively summarized in the quote from Arthur C. Clarke that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It doesn't necessarily require us to say that they had flying saucers or ray guns. Even Columbus's ships were seen as magic in the eyes of the natives he came into contact with. At this point, it's fairly obvious to point out that those who advocate for the ancient alien theory and those who advocate for a lost advanced civilization are essentially looking at the same body of evidence. The former just looks to explain the cause as extraterrestrial, while the latter as a lost group of more advanced human beings. I personally lean towards somewhere in the middle. Perhaps it was an outside influence working through human beings, more indirect and perhaps spiritual than alien craft landing on Earth, but nonetheless present. More akin to what Plato describes, guiding and steering through the rudder of persuasion. Consider the many brilliant minds of the world who claimed to have gained their knowledge from supernatural beings or divine influence and revelation, such as Socrates and his daimon. At this point, we can draw many parallels to the apocryphal Book of Enoch. In it are described in more detail the Watchers, or angels who came to Earth, alluded to in Genesis. A particular passage of interest reads, "And Azazel taught man to make swords and daggers, and shields and breastplates, and he showed them the things after these, and the art of making them, bracelets and ornaments, and the art of making up the eyes, of the beautifying of the eyelids, and the most precious and choice stones, and all kinds of colored dyes. And the world was changed. And there was great impiety and much fornication, and they went astray, and all their ways became corrupt." In another passage, it is said that they are also taught the use of magic, roots, and herbs. Furthermore, it is explained that the angels took human wives, and they bore children who became giants, who devoured the toil of men until they could not sustain them, and were also violent towards all life.
I will destroy your village with the stump of my foot.
It is this illicit intervention which directly leads to the flood, which wipes the race of giants from the face of the earth. All of the main thematic elements of the Atlantis story are present here. The union of divine beings and humans and the subsequent corruption, the teaching of warfare and other skills, echoes the Atlantean sophistication and military prowess. And lastly, a passage concerning the fate of the giants bears an uncanny semblance to Greek mythology of the first men of the Golden Age, who we are also connecting to Atlantis. Quote, "And now the giants who were born from spirits and flesh will be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth will be their dwelling. And evil spirits came out from their flesh, because from above they were created. From the holy watchers was their origin and first foundation. Evil spirits they will be on the earth, and the spirits of evil ones they will be called. And the dwelling of the spirits of heaven is in heaven, but the dwelling of the spirits of earth who were born on the earth is on earth. The takeaway here is that the spirits become earthbound. Now consider this quote by the Greek historian Hesiod, who speaks of the original golden race of men. Quote, "But now that fate has closed over this race, they are now holy daimons upon the earth, beneficent averter of ills, guardians of mortal men." Obviously, there is a difference here between the characterization as being good versus evil, but in essence it's the same idea that they become earthbound spirits. And this helps to tie together the idea of giants and the original race of humans, who we are suggesting were a part of Atlantis. Beyond universal myths, proponents of the Atlantis theory point to an array of other cultural universals which defy the odds of coincidence, asserting that they can only be accounted for by the existence of a mother culture which, in the remote past, seeded other civilizations. Recall back to the beginning of the episode in Plato's account, which states that Atlantis held significant influence on both continents. Now, the fact that Plato even references what can only be assumed to be North America is remarkable in itself. How could he have known that? That's something I forgot to bring up in part 1, but it is explicitly referred to as a continent encircling the greater ocean, the real ocean, beyond the Mediterranean. The idea that separate cultures could originate from a parent culture is the theory of diffusion, which was actually quite popular among pre-Victorian scholars. But in the last few decades, the prevailing attitude shifted in favor of independent invention theory, which posits that groups develop in similar ways over time because people are essentially all the same. It can be rightly assumed that necessity, as the mother of invention, leads separate groups to develop the same basic solutions to human needs which are universal. There is also clearly a universal human nature that plays a role. This leads to the same basic inventions and their primary qualities, like the existence of a language. But when the secondary qualities are also shared, such as the same words or style of dress, these ancillary qualities that are not essential, this theory seems to fall short. Ignatius Donnelly points to other holes in this theory, such as why different peoples of the world do not all follow this same pattern of development, seemingly unable to progress, and why for thousands of years, and arguably today in some sense, humanity did not progress past the great heights which had been achieved in ancient Egypt, Greece, Sumer, and Mexico. If it was a natural, spontaneous process, we should see all cultures rise together and continue to improve on what came before. But instead we see this great disparity, followed by a downfall of some of the greatest cultures. Rather, it appears that the knowledge was transmitted from a previous source only to certain groups, and that knowledge was eventually lost as the connection to the mother culture was severed and its wisdom forgotten over time. Researchers point to ancient Egypt and Mexico as being two primary Atlantean colonies, and cite their cultural similarities as evidence. Anthropologists have noted that many of the same words with the same meanings were used in both cultures. The same headdresses and other raiments appear in both cultures. In the earliest records, the Egyptians describe and depict themselves as red-skinned, We also see physical similarities between the god kings of both cultures, who were depicted as having beards and elongated heads. Perhaps the practice of artificial cranial deformation seen in both the Yucatan and Egypt, as well as the Egyptian pharaonic custom of wearing fake beards, was meant to emulate the natural physiology of the ancient Atlantean rulers, which they saw as gods. We know that these things were seen as a symbol of status, because the gods were the first royalty, and all future rulers were legitimized through divine descent. These practices probably came about when the bloodline became diluted over time as an attempt to hide it, which is further indication that the early rulers were people from another place with different genetics. We now know that there were, in fact, ancient humans who had these natural characteristics. The elongated Paracas skulls, uncovered in Peru, have been shown to not have been the result of artificial deformation, but rather their natural morphology. Their cranial volume is 25% greater than a normal human skull. Furthermore, DNA tests have shown that they are not purely Native American. On the east coast of North America, we see again similar descriptions of people in the legends of the moon-eyed people, who were said to be of pale complexion and were bearded, and it is said by the Cherokee that they were already inhabiting Appalachia when they arrived. They are credited with the mounds and other structures found in North America. The Serpent Mound in Ohio seems to be reminiscent of the same religious symbols of the Nahua as well, depicting a great snake with its head aligned towards the setting sun during the summer solstice. All of this is to suggest that perhaps we are not only dealing with a lost civilization, but also a lost race of ancient humans, those who were described as giants in all the ancient myths. Another anomaly worth noting is the presence of markedly African features in the carved heads of the Olmecs. The presence of different racial groups in areas where they were not thought to have existed may point to a transatlantic travel in the ancient world, perhaps suggesting the existence of land masses that once connected the old world and the new. The Seminoles carry a memory of a land bridge that once connected America to Europe. There are several remarkable legends recorded in the Americas which may shed light on this racial enigma. Of the origins of man in Aztlan, presented in the Popol Vuh, Bancroft writes, quote, "All seem to have spoken one language, and to have lived in great peace, black men and white together. Here they awaited the rising of the sun, and prayed to the heart of heaven." It then tells how the land became overpopulated, and different groups began to migrate to different places, causing the common language to become confounded. This is similar to the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, where humanity was once unified in a common tongue which became fragmented and scattered. This is a universal story of diffusion of all now separate races coming from a common source. Another compelling historical enigma that may point to a lost mother culture is the mysterious origins of the great civilizations of antiquity. Both ancient Egypt and Mesoamerca appear almost inexplicably. They seem to come out of nowhere with virtually no antecedents. The level of sophistication which they reached should have taken thousands of years of slow progress, and yet the evidence for that is significantly lacking. British historian George Rawlinson remarked on this enigma, quote, "Now, in Egypt, it is notorious that there is no indication of any early period of savagery or barbarism. All the authorities agree that however far back we go, we find in Egypt no rude or uncivilized time out of which civilization is developed." Joseph Seiss also echoes this sentiment. Quote, "It suddenly takes its place in the world in all its matchless magnificence, without father, without mother, and is clean apart from all evolution, as if it had been dropped from the unknown heavens." Perhaps the reason for this is that the evidence was destroyed, and that Egypt's parent culture now lies at the bottom of the sea. We have a similar situation in Mexico. The city of Teotihuacan is a prime example, a name which translates to place where the gods were created. This is where the earliest known depictions of the feathered serpent appear. The city is in itself a mystery, as archaeologists still have no idea who built it. It became later occupied by the Aztecs, who admittedly were merely its inheritors. It does not appear to be the product of slow development, as whoever built it seems to have done so as part of a preconceived master plan. It has now been shown through LiDAR scans that the city itself is organized on a grid, and is laid out according to precise geographical and astronomical alignments. It appears to be the product of master masons at the peak of their craft, who clearly had experience in what they were doing. Lastly, there is increasing evidence that these civilizations are far older than was initially assumed, which if true would show that they were antediluvian and existed at the same time as Atlantis, or were at least started not long after its destruction, making the theory of diffusion more plausible. Atlantis and the cause of its destruction has been the subject of a litany of metaphysical speculations among occultists and channelers. Helena Petrova Blavatsky, prolific esoteric writer and progenitor of the theosophical spiritual movement of the late 1800s, writes, quote, "Under the evil insinuations of their demon, Thevatat, the Atlantis race became a nation of wicked magicians. As a consequence of this, war was declared, a story which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. The conflict came to an end by the submersion of Atlantis." Manly Hall writes, quote, "From the Atlanteans, the world has received not only the heritage of arts and crafts, philosophies and sciences, ethics and religions, but also a heritage of hate, strife, and perversion. The Atlanteans instigated the first war, and it is said that all subsequent wars were fought in a fruitless attempt to justify the first one and right the wrong which it had caused. Before Atlantis sank, it spiritually illumined initiates, who realized that their land was doomed because it had departed from the path of light, withdrew, carrying with them the sacred and secret doctrine. They established themselves in Egypt, where they became its first divine rulers. Nearly all the great cosmological myths forming the foundation of various sacred books of the world are based upon the Atlantean mystery rituals." As an initiate of the Eleusinian mysteries, it is probable that Plato and/or his sources contrived elements of the Atlantis story to embed within it occult spiritual philosophical principles. Metaphor is a form of cipher, a secret or disguised way of writing which was commonly used by members of secret orders. It is said that many of the ancient sacred texts, including the Bible, incorporate various forms of ciphers. This was done sometimes to avoid persecution, but moreover, it was often used to keep what was thought to be privileged and sacred information away from the profane, the masses, who were thought to be unworthy to possess it. So far as it concerns Atlantis, among the theories along this line of inquiry are that the 10 kings represent the points of the Tetrachus, the sacred symbol of the Pythagorean cult, which represented the monad and its emanations which construct the universe. The kingdom being comprised of 3 large islands and 7 smaller ones, symbolizes the triune power of the deity and the 7 planetary regents. The sacred mountain in the central island is the Axis Mundi, the world mountain connecting heaven and earth, known to many cultures. This indicates the spiritual state of man during the Atlantean epoch, or the time before the fall of man. The sinking of Atlantis, corresponding to the original perfect state of union with the divine, which many religions refer to as being the first days of man. The sinking of Atlantis, corresponding to the archetypal fall of man, represents the descent of spiritual man into his physical form, within the illusory realm of materiality. This is the central tenet of Gnosticism and Hermeticism and other ancient mystery traditions which we have discussed in past episodes. Hermes Trismegistus, who gives us much of this information, is also credited with having recorded the story of Atlantis on the pillars underneath the city of Sais. The city of Atlantis itself, the archetype of the holy city, found in many religions, may speak to this former spiritual state, and the prophecy of its re-establishment, such as is found in the New Jerusalem of Judaism, represents man's desire to return to this perfect state and to become reunified with the divine. An interesting Nahua legend which connects to this idea is that of the trials of Hunahpu and Xbalanque, the Maya hero twins who traveled to Xibalba, a name which translates to the place of fright and represented the underworld. The association of Xibalba with both the land of the Nahua origin and the underworld may hint at the cataclysm which destroyed it, also connecting to Tir Nanog, which was said to be underneath the water or underground. Recall the original humans in the area of Atlantis who were said to have dwelled within the mountain. A common Genesis story among the North American natives also states that they originally lived under the earth before a great flood drove them to the surface. Once the brothers reach Xibalba, the 12 princes issue a succession of 7 perilous trials that the twins must endure, passing through a series of mysterious subterranean chambers. The brothers must use cunning and wit, rather than force, to pass each test. In the final ordeal, they enter the House of Bats, where the god Kamazotes, who we discussed in the vampire episode, beheads one of the brothers. He is resurrected with magic. Both eventually pass the final test and ascend to heaven.
We did it!
It is suggested that this story is actually recalling an ancient mystery tradition. British-American archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon writes, "Do they not seem to be an exact counterpart of what happened in a milder form at the initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, and also the greater mysteries of Egypt from which these were copied. Dr. Guthrie, in his introduction to the Popol Vuh, suggests that the 12 princes represent the signs of the zodiac, and the 7 trials, the 7 planetary spheres, through which the candidate must pass to achieve enlightenment, a process which was embraced by the aforementioned mystery traditions. Through this, the candidate undergoes what is known as the philosophic death and the second birth. So here we may have yet another link between the Americas and Eurasia, in the common ancestral spiritual heritage of the lost parent civilization, which appears to be centralized around astro-theological ideas. Whether or not we are able to take any literal truth from the story of Atlantis, or similar tales of these mysterious homelands and their paradise lost, we should still acknowledge their common moral underpinning, which is no less relevant to our time. Whether it is in the form of the sinking of Atlantis, the end of the Golden Age, or being cast out from the Garden of Eden, it is always said that these disastrous ends came about when human beings failed to keep the laws which were given to them. These myths seem to speak to an inherent quality within us to seek more, to push beyond our limitations and embrace the mystery of existence. It is truly our greatest asset, for it is said by some mystics that the fall into corporeality was necessary for the development of self, and in turn, our conscious evolution. In life, so often the path must be found by wandering in the dark. As Nietzsche said, "The tree that would grow to heaven must send its roots to hell." But this intrepid spirit can also be our folly when taken too far or put to evil ends. The universe seems to allow for and encourage growth. Perhaps we must grow as a manifestation of the universal will and not as an aberration, in union with nature and never forgetting our station. Wherever the gods went, they imparted knowledge to elevate human existence, but also a code of laws. As we come into the era of unprecedented access to information and more advanced technology, it is all the more important that we do not forget this, for with greater power comes the potential for greater disaster if it is mishandled. Whether or not we want to say that these repercussions for our actions are brought about by supernatural agency, we must acknowledge that a natural order does exist, of which man is a part, that all these systems function interconnectedly in perfect balance, which, if disrupted, can cause violent reactions, which in actuality are simply the system's way of correcting the imbalance which has been created. Perhaps what has been called the wrath of the gods, or the scourge of demons, is in truth simply this corrective reaction of nature to our actions, not an act of pettiness or spite, but an impersonal force, which nonetheless ultimately works for the greater good of all. This is karma, the law of cause and effect, and when man saw this as an act of cruelty, it was because of his own inability to recognize that he had done anything wrong in the first place. The North American Mandan tribe recalls that, quote, "The world was once a great tortoise, born on the waters and covered with earth, and that when one day, in digging the soil, a tribe of men, who had made holes in the earth to a great depth, digging for badgers, at length pierced the shell of the tortoise. It sank, and the water, covering it, drowned all men, with the exception of one, who saved himself in a boat. And when the earth re-emerged, sent out a dove, who returned with a branch of willow in its beak. These stories seem to imply that we inherently sense that the natural state is perfection, and that somehow, through our efforts, this state can be restored, and that the only thing that truly stands in our way is ourselves.